A League of Their Own, 1992, one of the most beloved comedies of its decade, the film that introduced most of America to the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League, the film that crossed $100 million at the box office, the first time a female director had ever done that. It also almost never got made. The lead actress walked out weeks before filming. The studio that developed it let it go, and the most quoted line in the film was nearly cut. Today, 15 facts. From the casting chaos that almost derailed everything, to the real survivors who filled the final scene, to the darker ending that Marshall cut at the last minute. Stick around. Fact 1. Penny Marshall discovered the story watching television alone one evening. A 1987 public television documentary about the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was playing, and Marshall, who had just directed Big, was watching with growing disbelief. She loved baseball. She had grown up around the game. Here was an entire professional women's league, with its own teams, its own championships, that had slipped clean out of the national memory. A pair of producers had already been chasing the rights to the same story, and had Marshall at the top of their wish list before she had any inkling the project existed. A piece of American history so far outside the accepted story of the sport that a lifelong fan could live an entire life without ever hearing it told had nearly stayed buried for good. Fact 2. Fox developed it, lost its nerve, and let it go, and Columbia took it. 20th Century Fox sank money into development, got cold feet, and pushed the project into turnaround. Marshall stepped away to direct Awakenings. The baseball story sat on a shelf. Columbia grabbed the property while it was loose. By the time Marshall came back ready to return, the project belonged to a different studio. The company that decided it could live without the picture watched a direct competitor turn it into one of the year's biggest hits, a film that had slipped through one studio's fingers and crossed 9 figures for the company willing to take the chance. Fact 3. Demi Moore, Deborah Winger, and several others had the lead before Geena Davis. The role of Dottie Hinson changed hands so many times, the casting itself became a small drama. Demi Moore was an early favorite before pregnancy took her out. Deborah Winger was cast next and committed hard, training with the Chicago Cubs organization to build physical credibility from the ground up. Then, weeks before filming began, Winger walked away. Her reported reason was the casting of Madonna alongside her, a decision she felt cheapened the serious project she had signed up for. She left with a pay-or-play settlement, reportedly, in the millions. Geena Davis stepped in, inherited the friction, and delivered the performance the film is now built around. Fact 4. Tom Hanks was told to get heavy so no one would find him attractive. Most actors spend the months before a shoot shaping up. Marshall gave Hanks the opposite instruction. Jimmy Dugan needed to read instantly as a man who had let himself go completely. She told Hanks to put on as much weight as possible and ensure nobody would find him attractive under any circumstances. Hanks obliged without complaint, softening one of the most naturally likable presences of his generation into a bloated, unshaven, shambling has-been. The studio could have sold his charm. The film needed him to bury it. Fact 5. The sisters at the center were drawn from real women the screenwriters knew personally. The rivalry between Dottie and Kit didn't come from imagination. Kelly Candale and Kim Wilson wrote the story drawing directly on their own mother and aunt, 2 women who had actually played in the league. The competition between a steady, gifted older player and a more volatile younger one came from life. The filmmakers were careful. Dottie and Kit were inspired by rather than modeled on the real women, letting the script chase emotional truth without pretending to be biography. Candale's mother lived long enough to see the finished film and to watch Hollywood treat the league she had given part of her youth to as something worth remembering. She died only months after its release. Fact 6. There's no crying in baseball was nearly cut for being too throwaway. The line arrived on the page as filler, a beat the writers tossed off without expecting anyone to remember it. What turned it permanent was an accident. Biddy Schramm, playing the player being scolded, cried on camera without prompting. Those unplanned tears handed Hanks the opening he needed. He drew himself up and delivered the protest with such conviction that Marshall kept the entire take exactly as it happened. The American Film Institute ranked it among the great movie quotes in cinema history. The Writers Guild requested the original handwritten script page. A throwaway nobody believed in became the thing most people can still recite from the film. Fact 7. The cast trained 8 hours a day, 6 days a week before a scene was shot. A full regimen run by genuine coaches and a technical advisor brought in to turn working actresses into convincing ball players. Marshall wanted her leads to throw, catch, slide, and swing well enough that the film would rarely need a body double. The women drilled fundamentals until the motions looked native rather than coached. For a comedy, the physical demand was extreme. By the time principal photography began, the skill on screen was entirely their own, paid for in months of bruises before the stadium lights ever came up. Fact 8. The actresses absorbed injuries some carried for years. Because the women did their own playing, the wear and tear was no illusion. One actress carried a thigh bruise so severe it lingered for years after filming. Another took a mitt to the face hard enough to break her nose. A third later said she had broken a foot during the long shoot. Davis described what it meant to slide repeatedly in the short skirts the real league had worn. Skin scraped clean off players' legs. Take after take. The grace the camera catches was being paid for in skin and bone by performers who absorbed every hard hit themselves. A studio that let it go, a lead role that changed hands 4 times, a throwaway line that became one of the most quoted in cinema history, a cast taking real injuries making a feel-good comedy. We're not halfway through. Still coming, the private backstory Hanks invented that never appears on screen, the charm school rules that turned out to be historically accurate, and the bonus, the darker ending Marshall cut, and why cutting it was exactly right. Fact 9. Tom Hanks invented an entire backstory for Dugan that never appears on screen. For a long while, the character wouldn't come into focus. Hanks could play the bitterness on the surface, but kept failing to find the deeper wound underneath. The script didn't hand him the answer, so he built it himself. His invented history. Dugan had wrecked his knee in a clumsy, late-night scramble out of a situation he had no business being in. A self-inflicted injury that ended a promising career and left the man with nothing but regret. That backstory unlocked everything else. Almost none of it reaches the screen as dialogue. All of it shapes the shadow of every scene Hanks is in. Fact 10. The charm school sequences are almost entirely historically accurate. The strangest touches in the film feel like broad period comedy. Chaperones, deportment classes, fines for unladylike conduct, athletes required to slide in skirts. Almost every bit was real, lifted directly from the league's own rulebook. Surviving members of the real league confirmed the filmmakers had, if anything, undersold how strict the regime could be. All of it grew from institutional anxiety. The league was trying to sell the sight of women playing a hard, traditionally male game to a wartime public that might reject it, so it wrapped its athletes in a carefully managed femininity to make the product feel safe. Fact 11. The film contains a silent acknowledgement of baseball's color line. A ball skips loose and rolls toward a black woman standing outside the fence. She picks it up, holds it a moment, then fires it back with a throw so hard and accurate it stops the players cold. The exchange lasts seconds, carried by Hans Zimmer's score with no dialogue. The moment acknowledges what the film mostly leaves alone. The league was segregated, closed to black players in the same era the sport drew its color line. A woman with undeniable talent stands on the wrong side of a fence for no reason that bears defending. She throws the ball. The scene moves on. Fact 12. The finale was filled with real survivors of the actual league. For the closing sequence at the Baseball Hall of Fame, the production filled the reunion with genuine surviving veterans of the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League rather than hired extras. The women whose buried careers the film had been about were gathered to watch their erased history finally placed in the official record. One former pitcher delivers the sequence's most significant line, calling Davis's character, with no fanfare, simply the best player in the league. The real women and the invented characters shared the same frame. The film handed the moment back to the people it had always been about. Fact 13. A television series based on the film lasted only a handful of episodes. CBS launched a weekly series in 1993, with Marshall directing the pilot and several film cast members returning. It drew weak ratings immediately and was canceled after only a handful of episodes, never managing to recapture whatever had made the original work. Not even Hanks directing an installment could move the numbers. The film lived for decades. Its television cousin vanished almost overnight. Fact 14. The candy magnate who built the league was barely disguised from his real-world counterpart. The fictional Walter Harvey, the candy tycoon who bankrolls the women's league to keep his ballparks earning while the men are at war, is a barely disguised version of Philip K. Wrigley, the chewing gum magnate and Cubs owner who helped launch the real league for similar reasons. The tryout scenes were filmed at Wrigley Field itself, named for the family the fictional Harvey was modeled on. The warm comedy rests on a piece of business history that is slightly less comfortable to examine directly. Fact 15. The film was the first directed by a woman to cross $100 million domestically. More than $100 million in domestic ticket sales, earned by a modest summer comedy many critics had filed under pleasant and minor. That made A League of Their Own the first film directed by a woman to clear the domestic $100 million mark. A barrier fell while the audience was busy enjoying themselves. The Library of Congress eventually added it to the National Film Registry, the same protected list as the acknowledged classics of American cinema. Time did what time occasionally does, turning what was once described as charming light entertainment into something a whole country decided was worth keeping. And now the bonus I've been saving for last. The ending, the two sisters holding each other without a word, almost gave way to something considerably darker. An early draft pushed the final reunion into an explicit confrontation. In that version, Kit asks Dottie directly whether she deliberately let her win the deciding game of the championship. The question drags into the open the suspicion the finished film lets hang unspoken. The possibility that Dottie, the stronger player, dropped the ball at the plate on purpose to hand her younger sister the biggest moment of her life. Spoken aloud, that accusation would have turned a tender, ambiguous farewell into something closer to an interrogation, robbing the two sisters of the one thing the finished film grants them: a quiet refuge from the rivalry that defined their relationship. Marshall judged it too dark and cut it. What remains is a simple embrace, no words, no answer. Whether Dottie threw that final play is left entirely for the audience, and every viewer fills the silence with whatever private family history they carry into the theater. The film is more beloved today precisely because it refused to tell you.